Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation. It's always good to work with Professor Shaban and my colleague Reverend Coffin. We have just recently completed the Jewish holiday of Passover, and besides not being able to eat any pizza for a week, so I really appreciate having that here today. The focus of that week is freedom. But it's not just the physical liberation from slavery in Egypt that we remember. It's spiritual liberation, it's political liberation, it's national identity, and it's also economic liberation. One of the main parts of the Passover Seder, the ritual meal that we have on the eve of Passover, is to hold up a plate of matzah, which aren't particularly delightful things to eat. They're dry, crumbly, not very particularly tasty. And we recite a very ancient formula, which translates more or less as, this is the bread of affliction, or the bread of poverty, really, that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Let all who are hungry come and eat. There's a couple of important details there. One is that we call it poor bread, the bread of poverty, saying this is what we ate when we had nothing. The second is, even though we're remembering a time when we had nothing and we're sort of recreating the meager amount of food that we had, we're still saying we have resources and we need to share this with anyone who has even less than we had. During that week of Passover, we read every day of the 8 days here in diaspora, we read a section from the Torah, from the 5 books of Moses. And on the last day, we read this section that talks about, from the book of Deuteronomy, that talks about how you're supposed to handle someone who is an indentured servant, someone who as a result of poverty has had to sell themselves to work for you, to work off a debt or to earn enough money to pay off their debts. We're only allowed, according to that ancient text, in that time we were only allowed to have that person work off their debt for 6 years. On the 7th year, they were to go free. But they weren't to go free empty-handed. We had to give them something so that they didn't leave broke and end up back in poverty, back having to borrow money, back on the street, back as an indentured servant. It was not sufficient simply to say, if you pay off your debts and you get back to zero, everything's fine. We had to ensure that that person didn't end up back in poverty. This is done in part to make the contrast to our own experience as slaves in Egypt. As in slavery, there was no way to work yourself free, to work off your debts, to work your way out of poverty, to work your way out of the underclass. You were locked into it. And so as a result, we were compelled to recognize that there is such a thing as an underclass. There are people who are locked into poverty. They're trying to work their way out, but they find themselves, despite their efforts, at best breaking even. Having worked a number of minimum wage jobs in the first couple of decades of my working life, I know what it's like to try and make it on what's considered to be the minimum wage. The upshot of that is you really can't. Either you have to live in substandard conditions, or you have to go into debt. If anybody will even lend you money because you don't have enough income to even justify that. And that brings me to one other point that is brought up in these excerpts from the Torah that we read. From that same section in Deuteronomy, there are what appear to be conflicting messages. The first message is, there shall be no poor among you, because God is going to bless you in the land that God's going to give you. And yet, in the very next paragraph, a verse begins, when there's poor among you, this is what you should do. You should be generous, open your hand, don't turn a blind eye to it. On its surface, that doesn't make sense. On the one hand, we're saying there's never going to be any poor among you, and later on it says there's always going to be poor among you. So this is what you have to do. How do we reconcile those two seemingly contrasting messages? I think it's quite simple. The first one means there doesn't need to be any poor among you. You've got enough. If you have enough, there shouldn't be anyone without. It's all a matter not of if there's enough, but if it's being shared properly, if it's being distributed properly. The second one means this is what happens if somebody has too much, or access is limited, or you otherwise create a situation where people can't earn their fair share or receive their fair share or get access to their fair share. And that's what we're looking at. Poverty and hunger in the United States is an unnecessary evil. It's not that there's not enough food. It's not that there's not enough jobs. It's not that there's not enough to go around. There's plenty enough and more. It just isn't being made accessible in ways that allow everybody who has the ability and the desire to have a piece of that pie, if I may use a food analogy, to have their slice. And we see this manifest in so many different ways. Right here in Greater Orlando, a friend of mine and a good friend of mine and a congregant of mine is the executive director of Jewish Family Services, and they have the Perlman Food Pantry. They work with Second Harvest Food Bank, as do many other great organizations in Central Florida. And the Perlman Food Pantry empties out every week. No matter how much they get in the way of donations, they always give away and end up short at the end of each month. Why? Because the people who they service can get to the food pantry, but they can't necessarily get to a food store where they can afford to buy the same kind of quality food for their family. They live in food deserts. They don't have cars, they don't have access to public transportation. So they engage in a program with one of these agencies that brings them to a food pantry where they can get food, brings them to Second Harvest, brings them wherever they're going to go, and gets them back home. If those people could have access to good quality food in their immediate vicinity and not, fast food places or 7-Eleven where you get, not particularly good food for very high prices, it's not an opportunity for them to access what we all take for granted. If you have a car and a disposable income, you can get everything you want. If you don't have much of a disposable income and you don't have reliable transportation, you may live in an area which you are not within 5 miles of a place where you can get decent groceries. So poverty is not only from my faith tradition's point of view, but I think from a realistic demographic point of view, poverty isn't simply a matter of people not having enough. Poverty is a matter of there being enough or more than enough, but not everybody has the opportunity to share in that bounty. That's the message of we drove home again and again in Passover this last week before, and that's the message that I carry to you today, and I thank you.